You are listening to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. The Houthis in Yemen have launched drone strikes against the United Arab Emirates. Is this a new round of escalation in that ongoing and devastating war? Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. The ongoing civil war in Yemen risks an escalation with drone strikes launched by the Houthi against the United Arab Emirates. This is apparently in retaliation against the increased military campaign against the Houthis led by the Saudis and the UAE. The Houthis themselves, a group in control of Yemen's capital, but unrecognized by most of the international community. Our panel will explore the Houthi motivations for this strike, the impact on the ongoing and devastating Yemeni war, and regional security broadly. We're joined today by Hamoud Salhi, Professor of Political Science and Associate Dean of International Education at California State University, Dominguez Hills. He is a frequent commentator for Arab media and also for our show. Charles Schmitz is Professor of Geography at Towson University in Baltimore, Maryland. He's also an affiliated scholar with the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. He is the author of Houthi Visions of the State, a Houthi Republic with an Unofficial Imam and a Parasitic Political Economy. Thank you both for joining us. And in many ways, this is a bit of a checking in on a war that frequently, it continues, but frequently is not featured in the American press. So, Charles Schmitz, I'll ask you first. The Yemeni war involves this group, the Houthis, backed by Iran, who controls the capital, and a coalition led by Saudi Arabia and UAE fighting against the Houthis in kind of an ongoing strike that broadly doesn't seem to have changed much in years. Has anything changed in the last, say, 9 months or so since we last had you on?
Doug, that's a great question. Though it may appear that it's just constant fighting, there actually have been some important developments. So let me run through them to get us up to speed. In 2018, a group called the Amalika, the Giants Brigade, which is made up largely of Salhi from all parts of the country and are backed by the Emirates. They made their way up the coast, the Red Sea coast, and they approached Hodeidah. And at that point, the international community started making a lot of noise, saying that an assault on Hodeidah, which is the main port for North Yemen, would cause a crisis, that it would cause a humanitarian crisis, the fighting in the urban areas and whatnot. And eventually, the Amalika Brigade stopped, and there was an agreement made that basically neutralized that front. And following that, the Emirates pulled back from the war in Yemen. They announced they were withdrawing troops because they felt that this was going to be a stalemate, that the military because of the pressure from the international community, there was no real chance of making progress militarily. And they also appeared to be making an opening to Iran. The Emirates have a lot of relations with Iran, financial, economic relations with Iran, and they seem to be opening channels with the Iranians and backing away from the war in Yemen. And then when Biden was elected, of course, Trump had put the Houthi on the terrorist list. In the last minute of his administration, he put the Houthi on the terrorist list, and Biden took them off. And the Biden administration seemed to think that if they went after the war on the diplomatic front, they could, and they showed some good intentions, that they could bring the Houthi to the table and they could resolve the conflict diplomatically. But the Houthi read that quite differently. The Houthi read that as either that there was a coming negotiation and they wanted to move the military front as far as possible before the settlement happened, or they read it as a sign of weakness, and they pushed hard. And they pushed hard on the front in Marib, where they threw tremendous resources. Many Yemenis lost their lives as the Houthi pushed towards Marib. And Marib is significant because Marib is in the north of Yemen. It's the stronghold of the northern Yemeni military that opposes the Houthi. And it's also the place where there are significant oil and, well, there are important, let's put it that way. They're not very big, but on the larger scale, but there are important oil and gas resources that were there. And the Houthi were trying to take it. In the defense of Marib, the Saudi Air Force was critical. The Saudi, particularly the Saudi Air Force, because the Houthi had come out of the mountains and were coming across open ground, and it left them open to attacks from the air. And so in the defense of Marib, the Saudi Air Force was critical. And I think the Americans sort of came around to see, well, wait a minute, the Houthi are trying to solve this militarily. They have no interest in coming to the diplomatic table, and they won't until they have been stopped. And so the Biden administration said they were going to cut off offensive weapons to the Saudis. Eventually they said, well, we'll give them only defensive ones and whatnot. But they actually resupplied them with weapons that they could use in Marib, in the defense of Marib. The Saudis had limited their attacks to that immediate front for a long time. And the Houthi got very, very close. I mean, within kilometers of the main city of Marib. And then suddenly they took parts of the south in Shabwa, in Behan in the north. They took 3 provinces up there. And at that point, there seemed to be a shift. And this is the significant shift. All of a sudden, the Amalika brigades, which have been sitting up in a Hodeida doing nothing because of the agreement, pulled back and allowed the Houthi to take significant territory. And they redeployed in Shabwa. And they immediately took those 3 administrative areas, those 3 counties, we can say, of Behan in the north, and put the Houthi on the defensive. And the Houthi have been pushed back. The dynamics of the war have shifted. And now the Yemeni government has the initiative, and the Houthi are losing significantly. That's the context in which those attacks on the Emirates took place. They are warning against the Emirates, who have re-engaged the war, to say don't do that, trying to force the Emirates to get out, to make the Emirates pay for re-engaging the war in Yemen, because it's effective, because the Houthi are on their heels at this point. Where it looked like they were going to take Marib and make a significant sort of conclusion to this war, now they're being pushed back. And it's not clear where the pushing back is going to stop. There is a significant forward motion of the Yemen. So that's the context in which we understand these new developments.
So Hamoud, Salhi, the description here then is that the Houthi attack was really driven by their own growing military weakness as a way to try to compel UAE to not engage. I guess the first question is it likely to succeed, or is UAE's response likely going to be to continue, to engage, continue to pressure the Houthis?
It's a very, very difficult answer. And I think I'm repeating President Biden's answer, that when he talks about the conflict as a difficult solution. What's happening in the region since the UAE first began withdrawal from the conflict in Yemen, and then the fear that Ma'arab will be under the control of the Houthis take over the Ma'arab, the coalition between the Saudi and the United Arab Emirates apparently led to the Houthis' reaction. There are a lot of things behind the scene. There is one, the initiatives that are happening. On the one hand, you've seen since January 2021, I believe, when the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, came in and said, well, let's reach out to the Turkish. And you have a vast sort of a huge movement now with Turkey reaching out to Saudi Arabia, reaching out to the United Arab Emirates, and establishing, and even the latest proposal just weeks ago is to have trade that will save the Turkish UAE trade relation time if they go through Iran. So you have this sort of a group or a set of a bloc that is composing there, where the Turkey is now reaching out to the Gulf countries and being part of it. And then they even have reached out to the Israelis, and they have done all of this, but for the first time publicly, Erdogan comes and say, we are going to take the Israeli partnership as a serious partner, and we will do whatever we can to improve our economic conditions. Specifically, they are looking at the trade as a way to save their economy. So there is that block that is happening. What's very interesting there, you have Israel, who is part of the equation. You have the UAE and Iran on one side, and then you have Iran's involvement in Yemen. How much of those economic interests will be damaged by a continued attack of the Ansar group or the Houthis inside a United Arab Emirates, and also inside, it could be Saudi Arabia. They have done that, but there is no reason for them to do. So there is that factor. And then next to it, there is, one should not ignore that there is, on the regional level, the Arab subsystem level, you have the Algerian initiative, which is pushing to organize an Arab League meeting or summit meeting that will address seriously the issues of the regions, and including Yemen. Now, Israel, and also they are strong in favor of the Palestinians. They want the Arab to form that bloc. So Israel now is also interested in engaging inside Yemen, and particularly reports now said that the Emiratis have reached out to the Israelis to get intelligence, weapon, to preempt any strikes against them. So how likely the Houthis will respond is also linked to the Vienna negotiation or the Iranian negotiation. I think that's the main thing. If we are reaching to a solution, there are discussions today and this week, but there is a possible discussion, some kind of an agreement. I think that's where the Houthis are sort of looking for obvious reason. They are being supported by the Iranians, and they are being played, or in a way, to tap into the strategic depth of the Iranians on the one hand, helping them be stronger, and also weaken their partners. So it's a very, very difficult questions. And to point it out finally, that even President Biden, when asked just recently, is it time for the United States now to consider the Houthis or the Ansar as a terrorist organization, he said it's under consideration and all parties should come to discussing the conflict, which means it is no longer just about one party. He's also expecting the Houthis to do something. He's expecting sort of that all the Yemenis come together. So to answer your question, Douglas, and I know I went along, just basically tell you that I have no answer, but it does look like it's going to be further escalation. The determining factor is how the nuclear negotiation will go. If those goes well for the Iranians, maybe it's a way for them to put a brake on the Houthis to stop doing this.
And you listen to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. We are discussing the ongoing civil war in Yemen with Hamoud Salhi of California State University, Dominguez Hills, and Charles Schmitz of Towson University. So Charles, Hamoud raised the issue about these levels of complexity. There's actually two really interesting points here. One that I would like to first explore is this role of Iran, because the US is now diplomatically engaged in Iran, perhaps still early stages, but is Yemen likely going to have an influence, is going to be influenced, I should say, by US negotiations with Iran and the nuclear deal? Because I would imagine the Houthis have to recognize there's a possibility that the level of support they're getting from Iran would be weakened as a potential concession. Or is that unlikely, to play much of a role in the calculations in the war?
No, I think it is. It's complex. There's a lot of unknowns, but the technology that the Houthi have, the capability of hitting the Emirates is Iranian. That clearly came from Iran. And if Iran didn't want that to happen, it would not happen. There is the Iranian role there. The Houthi, there is a degree in which the Houthi and the Iranians, their interests don't coincide. The Iranians, of course, they love being able to harass the Saudis. It has advanced their position vis-a-vis the GCC, which they love. Of course, they're in a good position. But the Houthi are interested in ruling Yemen, stabilizing Yemen and ruling it. They want to be the rulers of Yemen. There was, interestingly, there was news of a very prominent Houthi, Salhi who came out and said that the directives of the Iranian ambassador, Iran had an Iranian ambassador who died recently in Yemen, and he said that the Iranian ambassador's directives hurt the Houthi, and I think he was referring to the offensive on Marib, that it cost too much. It was too costly. That they shouldn't have done that, and there I think he's speaking to many Yemeni are who would be supporting the Houthi, part of the Houthi organization, chafe a little bit at the idea that Iran is directing the leadership, that Iran is calling the shots, and so there is a little bit of difference. Thus far, it's the same. I mean, the attacks on the Emirates showed that the Houthi have capability of hitting the Emirates and of hitting Saudi Arabia, which they didn't have before. There were none of these attacks before the coalition offensive on Sana'a, on the Houthi. So the Houthi, I would think this was also inter-Houthi politic to a certain degree. So far, the forward position, the military aggressive position, which has coincided with the Iranians, has been forward. But there are other coalitions that say, okay, it's time to negotiate. We're in a strong position, and so that's a question also of what's going to happen within the Houthi leadership.
And so, kind of similar question, Hamoud certainly could talk about the role that Iran is playing, but you had highlighted the role that Israel is playing here. So immediately what comes to mind is this, how much is UAE motivated by these new openings that came from the previous administration, the so-called Abraham Accords, that seem to, suggest that there's at least some motivation. The Israelis have some lever of influence over UAE. And secondly, just I guess broadly, this question about Iran's influence and the new U.S. diplomatic engagement in Iran, in what appears to be at least some initial conversations about the Iran nuclear deal, and whether or not is Yemen going to be a part of that deal? Are the Houthis where they're going to be sold out by the Iranians in order to get that deal?
It's very, very complex. And there are several parts of it, and they are all connected. The linkages that you've seen just in recent days are puzzling. And the key issue, whether these countries are, I'm speaking of Saudi Arabia, Iran, United Arab Emirates, that are all involved in this Yemeni conflict, how much these relationships they are building will have an effect on how they address the Yemeni question, or whether can the Yemeni question be the area in which they all agree to put it as a status quo, that we are going to have problems there, not deal with it. But you've seen just recently an opening between the Saudi Arabia and the Iranians, where they open supposedly offices for the Organization of the Islamic Conference in Riyadh. And then both ministers of foreign affairs came out and said, we are both ready to open the embassies. And then you have the Saudi foreign minister come in and say, we'd love to have a relationship with Iran, except they have to take the Arab concerns. To which the Iranian respond, well, we welcome you to join the Hormuz Treaty, the Hormuz Agreement. And all the agreement, it basically says, the Gulf should be free of all intervention, no nuclear weapons, all of that. So you have this dialogue that is happening on this level. And then the biggest one of them, when you look at trades and you see the amount of trade that has been going on between the Emiratis. I mean, if you live in Dubai, you'll see Iranian, you wouldn't think that there is actually a problem between Iran. These are serious interactions that are happening in that region. The biggest fear, I think, for changing all of that is, number one, what you mentioned, and Charles mentioned very, very correctly, the idea of this negotiation, the nuclear negotiation. Where is it going to go? How Iran will respond to that? And are we going to get what the Iranian wants to get? But the other thing is this escalation, what Charles talked about, the military people who are behind, or the militaries who are behind attacking the United Arab Emirates. Can they sustain those attacks? And particularly with this economic interest that the Iranians have, and Iranians need an economic outcome. And it turns out that the Chinese project, the Chinese plan that they have may not be enough, may not come soon. So there are this series of problems that may have impact. I think the bottom line is, again, the nuclear issue is dominant. Obama administration thought they could have a deal and leave the issue of regional role of Iran and the ballistic missiles to a later stage. That position at this point has been sort of overlooked, or it seems to be part of a discussion, but not to the degree that Obama is going. I think a deal is needed, number one, for the Obama administration, because the Obama administration needs a win out of this, and particularly if the other front, the Ukrainian issue, fails.
Hamoud, you're saying the Obama administration. Do you mean the Biden administration?
The Biden administration.
Right. Okay. I was getting a little confused there. Yeah.
Yeah. The Biden administration needs a win, particularly if the other side is collapsing. We don't know how much his polling will go down on the elections coming up. So he needs to show some kind of result. And that's where a compromise from the United States is possible for the sake of achieving some kind of result. I think a resolution of that conflict could happen on that front. The other thing is possible, maybe the United Nations envoy is able to get initiative going, get some assurances from the UAE that the UAE will go back to its 2019 proposal to withdraw, or initially began to withdraw, and put the status quo and sort of idle the Yemeni question on one side, or get it going in a political negotiation under the UN envoy, and the Iranian nuclear issue continues to be discussed with someone. What's really clear is that there are some interests that are so much linked, and the failure for having a dominant power to achieve what you may call a zero-sum game. The Houthis initially, they were strong, and then the UAE and the Saudi Arabia come back and are winning now. As long as we are in that win-lose situation, and without a political leadership that comes and put a real agreement on the front, we are going to continue seeing this kind of a crisis that has a huge impact in other areas.
Now, Charles, we started off the conversation talking about diplomatic initiatives and the possibility of some sort of a negotiated settlement here, and the calculation on the part of the Houthis that if there's going to be some sort of a negotiation, let's improve our military as best as possible before we get to the table. Now that the Houthis, have to reason that, their position is weakened and probably will continue to weaken. I think of this notion of mutually hurting stalemate, bringing groups, to a table. Is this likely to motivate the Houthis to some sort of a negotiated settlement, or has it actually had the reverse effect, telling the Saudis, telling the government of Yemen that why not continue these rounds of fighting? Because if we can continue to erode the Houthi position, maybe we don't need to negotiate. That's a broad way of asking. Is there a negotiated settlement opening right now? And is it possible in the next, say, 6 to 9 months?
I don't see it on the horizon. The Houthi have refused to see the new UN ambassador from Sweden, Grunberg. He's never made contact with them. He's never, gone to Sana'a. They don't acknowledge him. It's a good question. I don't know. Hamoud is right to wonder how sustainable the Yemeni government's offensive against the Houthi is. They're moving now. going forward. But, if they get into the highlands again, I doubt they'll be able to sustain it. So it would be back to a stalemate. The Houthi really, they see themselves as the rulers of Yemen, and they see those that are fighting as mercenaries. They see those that are fighting them as mercenaries of the Saudis, Israelis, Americans, and Emiratis. So they don't recognize other Yemenis as political partners. Maybe it's propaganda, but I don't see the Houthi engaging in a political settlement that integrates the other parts of Yemen, the anti-Houthi parts of Yemen, into a state. So I at this point, I don't see this. I don't know. Yemen has surprised me many times, and many things I've foreseen have not happened and have been wrong. So, I don't like to prognosticate. I don't like to go into the future because it's impossible to tell. But at this point, I do not see a negotiated settlement. I see fighting until maybe the movement on the lines has stopped at some point.
We have about 90 seconds left, so I'll ask you the same question. Hamoud, Salhi, do you have any degree of optimism that there's a potential for negotiated settlement, or are we going to see more of the same?
Not for now, but what I'll be watching for is the upcoming, if it's held, Arab League summit in Algiers. The Algerians appear to be serious about having a constructive meeting. The Syrian return to the Arab League is one of the issue. The Yemeni issue is another one. The Algerian president has visited Egypt and had a meeting with President Salhi, and there are some discussions there that could lead somewhere. Also, the Algerians are siding more and more on the Saudi side on several issues. They condemned the latest attack by the Houthis in Emirates. These are all good signs that possibly we could see something there. I don't know what it is, or at least an initiative in the Arabic style, the Arab style, where it's more of a public relation, diplomatic talk rather than substance. But there might be something there. But if you're asking me a direct question, as much as I am a hopeful person, I see pessimism more than anything else in the Yemeni conflict, at least until we do another show on this.
Actually, a perfect segue. I hope the next time we have you on and check in, we have a little bit more optimistic, a little bit more hopeful news. But in the meantime, it seems like the civil war in Yemen just continues dragging on. And a reminder, it's been utterly devastating to the Yemeni people and the need for a resolution to this conflict. We've been discussing the ongoing Yemeni civil war with Hamoud Salhi, Professor of Political Science and Associate Dean of International Education at California State University, Dominguez Hills. He is a frequent commentator for Arabic media and for us as well here at Scholar Circle. Charles Schmitz is Professor of Geography at Towson University in Baltimore, Maryland. He is an affiliated scholar with the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and he's the author of Houthi Visions of a State, a Houthi Republic with an Unofficial Imam and a Parasitic Political Economy. Thank you both very much.
And that's it for today's program. Thank you for listening. The Scholar Circle is hosted by Doug Becker. Its managing producers are Ankina Agassian and Melissa Chifrin. Sed Dongre is our webmaster and assistant producer. Our archives are at scholarcircle.org, and our podcasts are on Apple and Google Podcasts and iTunes. Please follow us on @ScholarCircle or me @Armoudian and join our Facebook page. I'm the founder, anchor, and occasional host, Maria Armoudian.